Panel is being recorded. Please mute yourselves. And then we will also, I'll ask you to put the questions in the Q&A box, or actually in the chat box, and we'll address those as well. So hello, everyone. I'm Luis Cruz, Community and Public Relations Director at the San Diego Union-Tribune, host of the Together San Diego live stream, and a proud board member of the San Diego Press Club. Welcome to today's Write Better Right Now seminar with the Union-Tribune's Matthew T. Hall. This is the latest in a series of workshops and webinars with veteran print and broadcast journalists sharing with us their favorite writing tips and what they've learned throughout their careers. This discussion is scheduled for 60 minutes. I will ask our featured speaker some questions to get us started, but this is meant to be interactive, so please type in your questions in the chat box and we will do our best to address them. So let me introduce you to my colleague. Matthew T. Hall is the Union-Tribune's editorial and opinion director. He's worked at the Union-Tribune since 2001. Matt manages the ideas and opinion section, writing and editing editorials, and overseeing editorial cartoons, commentaries, letters to the editor, and the Name Drop San Diego podcast. Previously, he managed the newsroom's social media, was a Metro columnist, and worked as a reporter covering San Diego politics and East and North San Diego County. Matt is a graduate of the University of New Hampshire. He's currently serving as the president of the Society of Professional Journalists, a national professional organization with about 6,000 members. Matt's goals with SPJ includes strengthening its advocacy and diversity, implementing a new strategic plan to make it more meaningful to more members, and to give journalists support, inspiration, and better tools to do their jobs at a difficult time. Matt, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, happy to be here. And it is a difficult time, that's for sure.
Yeah. I also want to remind people there are some folks we don't recognize, so that means that you are probably not San Diego Press Club members. So if you are not, please consider joining us at sdpressclub.org. Matt, let's get started. So I guess let's just begin with how you got into journalism.
That's a great question. Well, I was born, actually, I was born a writer. My parents named the T, for those who are curious, who see my T all the time and don't know what it stands for. My middle initial stands for Thoreau. So I think my parents had high hopes for me, and I'm not sure that I lived up to them, but definitely landed in a writing career. So both my parents were writers, editors really by pay. And my dad worked in book publishing for a long time before he got into the mailing list industry, which is publishing, but by a different beast. And so I grew up, always with a book in my hand. That was before Kindles, when there actually were books in hands. And always wrote myself. I first wanted to write every day. I thought, wow, that'd be amazing to get paid to write. Are you kidding me? Like, that's possible. And I wanted to at first get into sports journalism because I love sports. And then I realized maybe I didn't want to write about something that I loved because I might not love it as much if I wrote about it every day. So I took the thing I loved the second most, which was politics, and decided to give that a whirl. And it stuck, you know what I mean? I think like all of us who kind of fell into writing, we do it because we love it and because we hate it and because we can't escape it. And I guess I haven't been able to escape it.
All right. So for aspiring journalists who may be watching this tonight, what are some writing tips that you would like them to come away with?
Oh, that's a good question too. I mean, I think writing starts with reading, especially in journalism, because we're talking about it through a journalistic lens. And I would suggest that you kind of get outside your bubble, whatever your bubble is. If you're a conservative, read liberal voices. If you're a liberal, read conservative voices. And find out what you like and then expand on that a little bit. Say your niche is environmental journalism or environmental writing, read as much as you can on that, but also read history. When I speak in front of a lot of student groups, I'm often asked, like, what should I pursue for a kind of a 4-year stint in do I need to be a journalist? And you don't need to kind of pursue a journalism career. It helps obviously to get that level of training, but as important, if not more important, at a university, in a university setting, is to get a broad base of understanding. It's often said about journalism that we know a little about a lot, you know what I mean? And so take history classes, take economics classes, take environment classes. I mean, the reality is we're all climate change reporters because that's increasingly the number one. Once the pandemic is over, it will continue to be the number one story on the planet. And so get as much information you can about as many different subjects as you can, and then you're kind of poised to do all kinds of journalism. The reality is a lot of industries, not just journalism, but a lot of industries need writers. So to the extent you can hone that skill by reading a lot, by following writers on Twitter, that's another good piece of advice. Find writers you like and see what they kind of write in short spurts all day long. But then also write yourself. And if you can't get a job writing, create a blog, which is the modern day equivalent of a journal, and just do that, because practice won't make perfect, but it'll come close.
You mentioned you started out as a reporter, and now you've moved into obviously the opinion and editorial director. How has your approach to writing changed, and how has it evolved?
That's a great question. Some people are surprised to hear that opinion writing in some ways is very like news writing. I mean, we follow the same standards. In the end, we get to have an opinion, but we try to do the same amount of reporting. We try to include all sides and multiple voices. We try to represent the other side faithfully. We may disagree with the other side or multiple sides, but we try to reflect their points of view in a way that they can at least feel we're taking them seriously, right? Because that's what my team tries to do. And so how it's evolved, I mean, it's interesting. I used to go to great lengths not to tell anyone my political points of view, right? So my wife didn't know who I voted for until more recently. When I became a columnist, I started to share a few more of my views. When I became addicted to Twitter, more of my views crept through. And then obviously on the opinion side, everyone knows, not necessarily what my personal opinions are, because if you see an editorial, it doesn't necessarily reflect my personal point of view, but it reflects the team that I'm working with and how we collectively view these issues. And so it was interesting. When I was a City Hall reporter, for example, I would count the number of lines I gave to either. So I was, for you longtime San Diegans, I was a political reporter, covered City Hall during the Mike Aguirre years, during the pension crisis, at the height of the pension crisis. And so there was a lot of people who were both upset with each other, and there were a lot of people at City Hall who were upset with the Union-Tribune, especially because its opinion pages were so hard on unions at the time. And so as a political reporter, I needed to be able to talk to union leaders and others and say, look, whatever you read on the opinion pages, that's not a reflection of my work or my journalism. Obviously, Bill Osborne and that team then work at the same shop as I did. But my journalism, as I said, was down to the line. Like, that's, anyone who complained, I could say, look, maybe I got it wrong, but here's the kind of extent I went to, the effort I went to try to make sure that everyone was equally represented. And I think as a journalist, as a news journalist, that's a pretty good method to have. And I'm not saying if you're writing about climate change, you need to give the deniers and the skeptics equal. Obviously, you do not need to do that. If you're writing about racism, there's not another side to racism. But if you're approaching, policy issues or the news of the day, some things have changed from news to opinion writing, but one thing that has not is trying to get multiple voices in our stories. I think that's what separates really good journalists from really bad ones, to be honest, is that you listen to all points of view and incorporate as many as you can in the limited space that you have.
All right, I do want to encourage everyone who's watching to make sure to, if you have a question or a thought, make sure to put it in the chat box so we can address it. Matt, give us a behind the scenes look then. How do you decide what you're going to write on, and tell us a little bit about the editorial process?
Good question. I always love pulling the curtain back on this because it's mysterious to a lot of people. And a lot of that is a failing of journalism, I think, writ large, right? Journalists in general haven't done a very good job of explaining not only what they do, but why it matters. And so, when you have everyone from the President of the United States down to local politicians using the term fake news as a weapon, it's dangerous and it hurtful for the industry, if not for us. I mean, I got a thick skin, so I can take a lot of those slings and arrows. But I do think that there's a lot of damage that can be done to the industry by journalists not explaining what they do. So I appreciate the question. We made a conscious decision during the pandemic when it first started, and then especially after the killing of George Floyd, that we wanted to de-emphasize what we thought as the editorial board and amplify other people's voices, right? So if you are a subscriber to the Union-Tribune, you will now see on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, there is no editorial. There is no Steve Breen cartoon. It's usually three. It's three op-eds, which are just commentaries. They're just expert opinions written by people around the community who have something to say. And I think, to pull the curtain back a little bit, I thought that is the most important change that we've made this year. And it was done because in March, people didn't care what a bunch of people sitting in their office at the UT had to say about a disease that was killing people. They wanted to hear from doctors, and they wanted to hear from therapists, and they wanted to hear from teachers and educators and people who had something to say that would influence people's opinions and change their lives. And so we really made a conscious decision then to share those voices and to kind of take a step back on ours, take the pedal off the metal a little bit, which is not to say that we don't have huge opinions. We do, and we share them, and we still value them. But then that we doubled down after the killing of George Floyd, where it was clear that this country was having a long overdue racial reckoning. And so we started to amplify communities of color, especially Black voices. And so one of the early decisions we made was to wrap the cover of the paper, which is very rare, to share an opinion piece on the cover of a newspaper. We've done it a few times to our detriment with editorials during the Doug Manchester years, where we editorialized for a mayoral candidate and for a stadium site. That was before I got on the board. We've only done a front page editorial once when I was on the board. It was when the Chargers left, and our editorial was good riddance, and I'm very proud still of that editorial. Then we put it on the front page. But this, the week of George Floyd's killing, we put 10 Black voices on our cover and made a point that week and in the weeks that followed to find voices that had emotional things to say, personal things to say, expert things to say, right? So obviously the pandemic is disproportionately affecting communities of color, especially Black and Latino communities. And so we wanted to, again, get to medical experts and education experts, but it just real quick, so that we show up every morning, the 7 of us Zoom in and we discuss, what op-eds to share, which editorials, when we do write editorials, that we'll write, how Steve Breen can approach certain cartoon subjects. And so one of the things I've done with the editorial board as well is that, it used to be a group of old white men with, when I started on the board, Blanca Gonzalez was there. So she was our one woman and our one journalist of color. Now the editorial board obviously includes Jeff Light, right, as the editor and publisher. So he is on the board, but does not meet with us on a daily basis. And there are 6 others of us, 3 of whom are old white guys, and 2 of whom are young women, one of whom is a mixed race heritage. She has a parent who's Vietnamese. And then we have Laura Castaneda, who a lot of you will know because she's been in San Diego forever and she's amazing. And so I think, this more diverse group, not as diverse as it could be, but more diverse than it has been, meets and talks about issues and tries to figure out whose opinions to share. It's a pretty important question, and it's not easy. There's so much going on in the world, internationally, nationally, and locally, that those are difficult decisions. But that's generally speaking, kind of whose voices we try to amplify and how we decide to do that.
All right, Marcia has a question here. Curious to know how the editorial works with Steve Breen and the political cartoons.
Yeah, Steve. I mean, Steve has 2 Pulitzer Prizes. He's amazing. He'd be a great. He's not a writer, but he'd be great for one of these sessions. I know you guys have talked to him before. Um, Steve generates his ideas. He approaches me sometimes later in the day than I would like him to with his drafts. And then, we pick one of his subjects if he has multiple subjects, kind of based on some of a similar calculus to our editorial question of what are the bigger stories of the day, what cartoon maybe could hold a day, what cartoon would we want to publish on Sunday, which is our biggest audience still. And then him and I work together on the language. If there's words in it, a lot of times a challenge that Steve has accepted eagerly and well is to do cartoons that have no language, which maybe doesn't sound as difficult as it is, but it's pretty hard to do that. And so, we'll kind of agree on the rough outlines of a cartoon and the language. We work with a community advisory board that we then send it off to so that they can weigh in, not for political reasons. They're not going to raise their hand and say, but you were either too hard or too soft on Trump. They're going to say, this is a misstep here, or you're not thinking of this through, or have you considered this? And obviously that was put into place after a cartoon that we pulled, the Jussie Smollett cartoon, which I'm happy to talk about as well. That was a couple of years ago now, where the African-American community reacted quickly and negatively to a cartoon. And it shouldn't have run in hindsight, so we apologize for it. And going forward, we created some new mechanisms to try to avoid a cartoon like that getting into print, one of which was the Community Advisory Board and their kind of oversight involvement in the process. Steve also tries to get his cartoons in earlier, but as I said, sometimes news happens and he switches gears late in the day. But I mean, Steve is, I think, not just a San Diego treasure, but a national treasure. He's a really talented cartoonist, both for his the cartoons that he draws, right, but also for the political points that he makes.
Rick has a question here. Will opinionated editorials always remain anonymous? Is that still the case?
Great question. I think that's a complicated question. I think you're starting to see some places devalue editorials and endorsements. Like if you look at the number of political endorsements in a presidential election from 2008, when it was like 98 of the 100 biggest papers in the country did endorsements, to 2016 and 2020, it's less than half. And you saw a famous example just a week or two before the election in Spokane, where they endorsed Donald Trump, an anonymous editorial board, and their editorial began, even though he's a bully and a bigot. Now, when you start there, it's tough to endorse someone, first of all, but they did it and they got blowback for it, not only because of who they endorsed and how they endorsed him, but because their editorial board, their anonymous editorial board, was one person, it was the publisher, which obviously by definition is not a board. And so the next day they got so much blowback from the community that they said, we are never going to do another presidential endorsement. In fact, we're not even going to do editorials either anymore or as regularly. And so I think, like one Twitter misstep can affect all of us and cancel all of us on any given day. That is something very real with editorials. You can have one misstep and have community members very upset at you. So I think, that and the fact that with a board like mine, like ours, which isn't really partisan, like, it used to be the editorial board would only endorse you if you're a Republican. And now, largely because some of the races only have Democrats in them by the time the general election happens, the majority of our endorsements were Democrat, but there were quite a few high-profile races where we endorsed Republicans. And so it doesn't matter to me personally or to the board what your party is. And so because of that, our endorsements can alienate half the city, depending on the subject and the day. And so that also is not a very good business model, right? So I think you are going to start to see more newspapers not only move away from, to answer your question directly, Rick, anonymous editorials, but editorials in general, right? And you're starting to see that in our paper, not because of the business decisions, but as I told you, we are kind of amplifying op-eds more so than editorials. And that, I don't care about obviously I do care about the business decision, but it's not front of mind for me. And I'm happy to talk to people who disagree with me, until my fingers hurt from typing, because I respond to most people on Twitter, unless you're a flat out troll, and most people who email me, unless also you're a flat out troll. But I do think there's a shift happening, and I use the presidential election endorsement analogy to show that 15 years ago, endorsements were everywhere, but now we have social media, we have hot takes, everyone has an opinion and can share it with their name. And so I think there's a value to that. But the reason why I still think editorials are valuable, and why I think the anonymity helps, is that we, in a day and age when people don't have time to spend researching and interviewing candidates and issues, that's what we do. That's what we get paid for. And it's a group of us, 6 of us, as I said, in a room, hashing out our disagreements, trying to find some consensus and some common ground so that we put forward opinions that represent that consensus. Anyone can have a hot take and spit something out 5 minutes after it happens. It takes a different kind of intentionality to sit back and collectively talk through the issues and then push out an editorial that hopefully is thought-provoking and thoughtful and represents kind of both issues, even if it comes down with a hard kind of ruling or decision in the end. So I think that you're going to start to see fewer of those, Rick, but I do think that there's a big value to them.
All right, Matt, I've seen your Twitter feed, and you've mentioned you have thick skin. You have to have thick skin in order to do your job. How are you able to handle such harsh criticism?
Luckily, San Diego has a really good craft beer community. No, I mean, I think it's, I will say that the nastiness has gotten more nasty, but I think it's kind of essential in journalism not to take yourself too seriously or your critics too seriously. Like the issue with deadline writing is that we can make mistakes every day and then come back the next day and hit something out of the park that people love and that influences government and changes policies. So I think it's helpful not to think too much of oneself in this business. And part of that is realizing that people who are criticizing you, hopefully they have valid criticism that you should listen to and take to heart. And so I think that's part of the job. But B, if they're really being mean and nasty, and some of us have gotten death threats or been told really, really incredibly horrible things, you just don't give that too much credit. And if it's really nasty, then you report it to the security team that we have who can, intervene on our behalf, which sadly we have to do from time to time. So I think part of that is the job at a certain level. If you have, a job at a major metropolitan newspaper, there's 1.3 million people or whatever it is in San Diego, 3.1 in the county, 6 if you start looking at Tijuana. So there's this huge universe of people who are going to be critical of you. And it's so easy with social media now to criticize someone. That's haters are going to hate, you know what I mean? But what we try to do in our comment section and on our social media feeds is kind of create a space that it caters to people who can disagree without being disagreeable, which is what we try to foster.
All right, let's get back to some audience questions. Jerry wants to know, is J School necessary to get started, or would expertise in a particular field be sufficient?
That's a great question. And I think what you're seeing is J School is less important. A, college is expensive. And B, as we were talking about earlier, kind of, anyone can write and anyone can see that you can write. So I would say that it's not necessary. It can be helpful. Obviously, it helps you get contacts, and it helps you meet people. And if you belong to a journalism group like SBJ or one of the affinity groups, NAHJ, NABJ, AAJA, NAHJ, NLGJA, and you go down the list, ONA, that can be helpful both in terms of networking and support. but not super essential. And I think you're starting to see pushback. You're starting to see newsrooms that by and large were run by white men and people who maybe went through the college system. You're starting to see people rightly calling for more voices at the table. And once you start getting more voices, you're going to get people who did not go to college, or certainly didn't go to a super fancy, expensive college. And so I think there's a value to it, but not crucial. And to your second question, I do think there's a value to learning a little bit about everything, right? So whether it's through the School of Hard Knocks, or you go to school and you learn a little bit about journalism and a lot about a lot of other things, there's a value to that as well. But I will say that said, I think increasingly when people don't even agree on what the truth is, that there is a value to saying, I went to journalism school and I learned how to do and approach some of this. I think, so I'm kind of all over the map with that answer. But I think increasingly journalism, no matter how you get into the field, that a professional journalist is important and should be part of any community that values democracy and truth, and is essential. I often say a free press isn't free. Journalism costs money. Less journalism costs society. And I, firmly believe that.
I just put my email address in the chat box. If you're a student or a teacher, email me for a free 1-year digital subscription to the Union-Tribune. Or if you know a student that would appreciate a subscription, just have them email me. All right, speaking of how journalism costs money, Jerry wants to know, what is the future of paid journalism? Is pay per article a viable model?
Yes. Yes and no. I think you're starting to see a lot of nonprofit journalism sites pop up. Obviously, we have some here in San Diego, iNewsSource and Voice of San Diego, that do outstanding journalism on a smaller scale. So the question is, does it scale at that level? And I don't think it does, or at least hasn't been shown to do so yet. The Union-Tribune has the largest newsroom in San Diego. And that means that there are some amazing journalists doing incredible work on a regular basis. But I think the business model is broken. And so what you're starting to see, or have seen for a while, is readership going down, advertising dollars going down. And so we're not just pivoting, but building new models of business around digital enterprise. And so at the Union-Tribune, we are now really pushing digital subscriptions, which if you like the hard copy of the newspaper, you can get a PDF version that is exactly what the newspaper looks like, and the ink won't come off in your hands, and it's easier to manage, but also gives you access to the journalism that we do on our site, which is, in some cases, totally different than the journalism we do in our paper. I'll give you a great example. On the 19th anniversary of the Columbine shooting, I wanted to do an editorial that really laid bare how destructive school shootings are and how nothing has changed. 19 years into Columbine, and we're still fighting the same battles and calling for the same reforms that we were. And so I had a reporter research all of the school shootings and the victims and how old they were. And so first we had to, this is journalism talking about truth and science, we needed to figure out what a mass school shooting was. Does that count if it is on a school bus, at a football game? How many people? And so we came up with our definition. And what we did in print was we used every dead person's name and age from 1999 through that year, 2018, to spell that those elements became the words that spelled out enough, or the letters that spelled out enough. If those of you who saw us will remember it. It was really a powerful image. It just ragged right. It just said ENOUGH on the paper. And if you look closely, you could see the names and the ages of those folks. Online, it wouldn't have the same impact. So we created a GIF that zoomed in on a few of the names and ages and then panned out. And as it panned out, you started to see, oh, that's an E. And oh, there's an N there. And oh, what is that? What spells enough? And it looped, and it was very powerful, especially when you saw the 6-year-olds who were killed in the Sandy Hook shooting. So I think paid journalism is powerful, but the trick now will be this kind of disconnect and different approaches between nonprofit journalism and for-profit journalism, and then just as much so the pivot from print, which is still valuable and still we have a lot of readers, to digital.
Martin has a couple of questions here. What career path would you advise for a talented journalism school graduate who wants to report for the Union-Tribune?
Great question. I think the path is different depending on where you want to go. I'm not sure that a lot of people dream of working at a big metro anymore. I think a lot of people want to work at a website like The Athletic or Vox, or maybe Voice of San Diego or Texas Tribune, or a website like that that does kind of hyper-local investigative journalism. But if you want to work at the UT, I think get an internship somewhere, get clips, work at your college paper, and then just get, maybe the path is similar to my path, which is work at a small paper. My first paper was a twice weekly. My second paper was a daily. Those were in New Hampshire. And then because it snows a lot in New Hampshire, I took a leap and I moved to San Diego. And on day one, I threw away my lock de-icer. How many of you guys know what a lock de-icer even is? Probably not many if you're not from New England. I took a leap and then worked at the Daily Transcript after freelancing, and then got a job at the UT. But in that process, I met people along the way who were with some of these journalism groups, or at the Daily Transcript, I met people who were reporters or editors at the UT. And so it's all about, I think, an internship and networking, and those two things will help you no matter what your path is, whether your path is a website or a big paper.
Martin's other question here, has the beat system changed? And if so, how?
Yeah, I think it has. I think it has to. I think, the notions of what we covered before are always changing. Like, we used to have breaking news reporters, and then we realized we're all breaking news reporters. Like I was saying earlier, we're all kind of climate change reporters now, because that ripples through everything that we do. Our beats used to be, I'll give you a good example. I was talking to someone today who said, yeah, we used to have like kind of I forget what they called it in their community, like the equivalent of MTS, right? We used to have someone who covered the trolley. Mm-hmm. And now they have someone who covers where do we go, right? So it's not like someone who covers the trolley and someone who covers buses and someone who covers cars. It's more like holistic. And I think you're starting to see that. I think you're starting to see people cover communities, right? So San Diego, the UT has gone through kind of cycles where we have a neighborhoods reporter or we don't. And right now we have a really good one, Andrea, who covers neighborhoods. And so I think the beat system will always change. There will always be, there'll always have to be public safety reporters and politics reporters, but what those people cover will change. And I would say that the best ones don't cover the meeting agendas, right? They cover stories out of meetings. Anyone can cover a meeting, you know what I mean? And sometimes you have to cover those. Anyone can cover a court hearing. But when you look for trends, like, those are the best beat reporters who look for trends and then can tie it up in what one editor used to call the A1 fairy dust, you know what I mean? And sprinkle that on there and tell a really strong story that you're not going to get off of any meeting agenda.
Lyle wants to know, what writers do you most enjoy reading?
Thank you for that question, Lyle. That's a great one. Novelists. I do not like reading journalism in my spare time because, my spare time is so limited. Like, I work from 6 to, I try to get offline by 9, and then I'm either watching television or reading at the aforementioned Kindle, or I do have actually some hard copy books that I read. Some of my favorite, and I also tried it in the last 3 years, I've tried to read more novelists of color. So I've read like N.K. Jemisin, whose Broken Earth trilogy I really loved. And I've read Ta-Nehisi Coates, and my favorite novelists are genre novelists. Like I like to read sci-fi, science fiction, and fantasy. And one of the best things that happened in the pandemic actually was when the county library system gave early on access to their library. Like you didn't have to go into the with a credit card bill or a phone bill or whatever to get a card. They just said, give us a phone number and we'll give you access to these amazing novels. And so um, that's what I did. If I had my phone handy, I could go through my Goodreads and tell you, I think I'm approaching 50 books for this year, which means I don't sleep a lot.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask you that. I was going to ask you, where do you find the time to read all those books? But
Yeah.
also, you're always working. I mean, how do you find the time to even unwind, and what do you do to unwind?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is that in the last week or so, I haven't. Daylight savings time really threw me for a loop. But before that, I was going on long walks, like sometimes 4 or 6 hour walks, usually 2 or 3 hours. Like sometimes I wake up at 5 in the morning or at 6 or 7 and go until I needed to be back for my morning meeting. And so I listen to books on tape, um, or I'm trying to avoid utility poles as I read my phone for emails and do the aforementioned work on the phone and make phone calls and stuff like that. It's tough being the president, the national president of SBJ this year has really cut into my time as well. So a lot of times on those walks is when I call people around the country. It's easier earlier in the morning to do that because they're on East Coast time. And so it gets a little trickier at the end of the day. But I'm kind of vampiric, like literally, I famously only take about 5 or 6 hours of sleep a night. Not healthy. I don't recommend that.
Let's see here from Carol. If you were asked to write an editorial to today's Congress, how would you word your lead, or would you write it at all?
To today's Congress? Well, we're talking about doing that with obviously the pandemic. I mean, if it wasn't a family newspaper, I might say get your shit together, because this Congress is a joke, flat out. I mean, we've had one stimulus during this pandemic, and it seems to me, and this is what our editorial along some lines will say, now it's pretty amazing, these two vaccine trials that have just been released, obviously early stages, but 90 and 95% efficacy is remarkable. And so I think as hard as this moment is in time, and difficult that it comes during the holidays when we like to get together and see our family members, we are not going to be able to do that to the extent that we have in years past. But there is this light at the end of the tunnel, right? This vaccine could come at some stage pretty early next year. And so I think we just have to get over the hump. And I think that hump involves Congress, first of all, helping people with rent, but also helping restaurateurs be able to stick around, because I don't think we want to live in a world where we all are vaccinated and walking around, but we all got to cook at home. Some of us will really love that. Some of us will not. And I think there's a lot of restaurants, as we've already seen, and bars who are done and they're not coming back. You've seen estimates between 20 and 80% of all those places are not going to be back. And I think, it's tough to say single out industries one over the other at this stage. But if we believe that a vaccine is coming and believe that enough people will take it, which is an open-ended question, to get herd immunity, an unfortunate open-ended question, they should, just to be clear, anti-vaxxers, we've written plenty of editorials that say that they are ridiculous, that everyone should be looking forward to this vaccine. But I think Congress has a moment here. And I think the president has a moment. A lot of people are suggesting that one thing he could do is do something. A lot of presidents in years, in president-elects in the beginning of their presidencies have come on board and consciously reached out to the other side and done some big thing, infrastructure or some bipartisan thing. Seems like a stimulus is a pretty good thing. And I don't know that it needs to wait for Joe Biden to be sworn in. Obviously, January 20th is a long time from now. But if I could write anything to Congress and have them listen to me, I would say, and help people who need your help.
Mm-hmm. Andrea, if you have a question, can you just put that in the chat box? And actually, anyone who has a question or a comment, go ahead and please put it in the chat box and we'll get to it. Um, so Matt, if people want to write an op-ed, how do they go about doing that?
Yeah. Here, I'm going to drop this email in. You can send it to us. That is our community opinion editor, Laura, as I mentioned her name earlier. Oops, wait a sec here. And she handles our op-ed submissions, which we say anyone can write us an op-ed. The only requirements, such as they are, should be 700 to 750 words. And that's just so we can get 3 on a page. It should be exclusive to us because we don't publish op-eds that have run in other newspapers or outlets. And once you're published, you can't get another one published for 3 months. We do that so we can diversify and amplify voices and not give someone a conduit to write for us with great regularity. Obviously, rules are meant to be broken. And so sometimes if we solicit an op-ed from you, you might see someone's name in there twice over a 3-month span. But that just means that one of those times we solicited the op-ed. Like some of the op-eds, we sit around in our meetings and we try to figure out who are the best voices to talk about subject X. And other times people send us unsolicited op-eds, which are truly great to receive. We get a really wide variety. We get so many that we can't run them all, unfortunately, but we try to let people know pretty soon after they've submitted one to us, whether it'll run right away or whether we're going to put it in a holding pattern. And especially now, some of the ones that we're getting for the holidays are really powerful, really, really powerful.
What were some of those topics? Can you talk about that?
Yeah. One, I don't want to steal the thunder of it, but it made me cry today, which doesn't happen much with an editorial, sometimes our editorials do make me cry, Freudian slip there, with a commentary. But the one that made me cry tonight was from Donna Fry. Some of you, obviously, most of you probably know her. Her mom died this year. Those who know her know how close she was to her mom. And just the way she told that story was really, you'll see when it publishes, really powerful. We have this Community Voices project, which is 45 San Diegans from a variety of backgrounds. Donna is one of them. And we asked all of them to write, in this crummy year where so much has gone wrong, what are you grateful for? And so, some of the ones that are coming in are nice. There are people saying, as part of my organization, I've helped X and Y and Z, or this year has been tough. Here's how I've done it. But when Donna wrote about her mom, it just really hit me. My dad died 2 years ago, and so it's still raw. And so anytime you get a really emotional piece of writing like that, that's what we're all trying to do, right? Is to tell stories that matter to communities that care. And Donna really kind of nailed that one.
Back to some more writing tips, and maybe you can share your experience. So how do you build rapport with people, sources you're trying to interview?
That's a great question. I mean, I'm kind of lucky that I've been working in the city for 20 years. So even the people who get angry at the stories that I write know that or I hope they know that I'm giving them a fair shake. I think that was one of the reasons why I was kind of considered for the opinion job, directing the opinion pages, is because I was a City Hall reporter for A, so long, and B, during such a difficult time in San Diego. So like I said, people in the business community, people in the city unions knew that I would give them all a fair shake. And I think that's just time. You know what I mean? It's like you don't earn trust in a day. You don't earn trust by, you got to write about the Arab American community, because I talked about that earlier, and calling up, Doris Batar or someone and say, I need to a voice in the, I need an Iranian voice. Can you help me? That doesn't build trust in that moment. But if you do that over time, over years, and then kind of quote those voices accurately and keep the secrets those voices, those communities tell you that they don't want to be shared. And, it's like with anything, trust develops over time. And I've been fortunate to be able to do journalism in San Diego for 20 years. And so I built up some relationships with people. Like I once saw I'm trying to remember which kind of cover band it was. Maybe it was like Van Halen cover band with like Kevin Faulkner, like years ago. I had no idea that guy was going to be mayor. And as from reading our editorials, we've been pretty harsh on Kevin Faulkner as mayor from the hepatitis outbreaks to calling 101 Ash the worst city real estate deal. But that's what I signed up for too. So I hope people who I'm reporting on and editorializing on realize that, I have a duty to San Diegans to reflect what they say, but ultimately to come down with an opinion that will be kind of make San Diego better, right? And so it's interesting that I came at editorial writing from the news perspective, because there's, as I said earlier, there's some similarities between the two, but also they're really different, but I do think ultimately journalism is talking to people and getting them to trust you, and that takes time and effort.
Do you have favorite interview questions?
I think the best question you can ever ask is, what did I neglect to ask? Your last question should always be, what didn't I ask that you want to tell me? What did I neglect to ask? What's important that I missed? But of course, there are many questions you ask before that point. And I think at the beginning, don't ask your toughest question first, unless it's a tough interview and you only have the one question. So that's part of a balancing act too. I mean, different journalists do have different approaches to interviews. I'm a list guy, so I will write down the questions I want to ask in the order I want to ask them. And if I sense the interview is tilting or is going to end soon, then I'll jump to the one question that I've asterisked at the bottom that I need to ask. So I think approaching an interview in an orderly fashion is, you can't, if an interview is important, you're not just talking to someone, you're thinking about the story, the interview, what you want to ask them about, what you want to tell your reader. So, any journalist worth their salt will kind of spend some time thinking that through, and maybe have done some interviews to get to that stage. Like, you're going to call people and say, I want to talk to so-and-so, what should I ask them? Right. So that's also an important question, is knowing, it's like in politics, the old adage is never ask a question you don't know the answer to. In journalism, that's not really quite the case, because we're not writing stories to fit our worldviews, but you kind of want to know where they're coming from so that it will help your interview, right? And to get them at ease, ask them about themselves as a human being, right? Maybe this is an investigative interview, or you're kicking the door in to talk to them interview. But if it's an interview, especially, and I think increasingly you're seeing more of these interviews with people who maybe they've never met a journalist. Maybe they don't trust journalism. So you want to get them thinking of you as a person, right? So ask them about their family, ask them about their background, ask them about their day. Don't just jump in with hard questions, because that's going to put people off.
What would you say to students about journalism today?
Pursue it, join it. You have to be willing to sacrifice, time and energy and effort. But I say, if you're curious and you're creative, and you believe that the only constant is change, then journalism I still think it's the best job going. And Nina, my wife, and I made a decision about 10 years ago when the industry started to tilt on its axis and all of our friends started to leave voluntarily or mostly involuntarily. This is a wave, and we're going to ride it until it crashes. You see a lot of people going into PR, especially government PR. Some people on this call and in the press club, and no knock on them. Those are valuable jobs, and the best. Some of my good friends have those jobs and do their jobs very well. But there's also kind of a confrontational aspect to that sometimes, when they are representing, their boss or their office and not the public per se, the same way a journalist views it. There's some overlap in the jobs, but but less so. And so my point is there are fewer jobs available for those students coming in, but at the same time, people's appetite and interest in news is bigger than it's ever been. Anyone with a phone can not only follow the news, but be the news. Like anyone with a phone literally is a journalist, but not a trained journalist. So the training that they can get at a school, at a university, is important.
All right, we have time for a few more questions. So if you want to put them in the chat box, please do so, and we'll try to get to them. Matt, I am curious, when you took over this role as opinion and editorial director, you had some pretty big shoes to fill. I mean, Bill Osborne had been at the Union-Tribune for many, many years. What was that like?
Yeah, he had been at the paper for 41 years. I know that because that's how old I was when I took the job. Bill Osborne is a great journalist. Still, he works with Voice. He's on their board, and it was great that the transfer from him to me, there was overlap, and that we worked together for a month or two, which I think is a rarity in journalism. Usually, it's like, oh, that person left, and maybe left unhappy, and so you got to learn to swim on your own. So good luck. Increasingly, kind of that's what's happening. So I was blessed to work with him for a while, writing editorials with him, editing them, and then kind of calling the shots with him close by. So he was great. I went to his going away party when it was a who's who of San Diegans who came to him and showed up at that party. This was pre-COVID, obviously, so we could have a party in a place like this. And we're thankful that he treated them seriously. I think that his board, as I said, was different than my board, both in terms of the makeup and in terms of its approach to things, but largely that was a construct of the ownership that he had to work with. I've also been blessed, to be honest, not to work with a Doug Manchester or a Copley family who was really involved, right? Like my first publisher was when Tronc owned us, and they were hands off. And then when Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong purchased the paper in the LA Times, also been very lucky. He's lets us do our thing. So it's really San Diegans writing for San Diego. So Bill was in a difficult situation, and he did really good work. And I point to one editorial in particular. People forget, like there was, and this is the importance of an editorial, right? A lot of people complained about toilet to tap early on in San Diego and used that language. And he wrote an editorial that said, the yuck factor, get over it. Science says this is totally fine. And you know what? Our editorial board has not taken that view, but we're going to switch, and we're going to explain to you, the reader, why A, science matters, and B, you should stop using that terminology and kind of get used to it, because we live in a desert, and this is a change that needs to happen. And so I think, I hold up that example to show one of the lessons that he taught me, which is it's okay to change your mind, but you need to articulate how and why, right? So we've done that before. In 2018, we endorsed Darrell Issa for Congress. Obviously, we did not endorse Darrell Issa this year. Darrell Issa won, so we have to be writing about and talking to Darrell Issa for a long time, a long time to come, at least 2 years, probably more, given that district. So change happens, but Bill showed me that you got to be kind of willing to acknowledge that change can happen, but then be upfront with your readership and explain to them.
Mm-hmm. All right, we probably have time for just one more question here from Dr. Giovanni. What's the interplay between the newspaper's editorial board and the paper's publisher?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was pretty not just minimal, but non-existent for most of my term. I guess I use the word term since I took the job in 2016. This election cycle, he wanted to be more involved in on the national and state level. And so I sent him a couple of the editorials, and he just said, basically, good one. So that's the extent of his involvement, which is great because, it would make me uncomfortable if the bottom line is it's the publisher's paper, right? And so when I was a columnist, some of the early columns that I wrote, if you remember, were about my support, and it seems even weird to even say this because it's such a old story, my support for same-sex marriage, which famously Doug Manchester did not support. And I wrote a column about my rejection of La Jolla's succession plan, which is more germane now that I live in La Jolla. I did not at the time, but I always thought that that was a stupid idea for La Jolla to want to secede. And you know what? Those columns published, Doug Manchester did not change my views, did not change my words, you know, but his involvement on the editorial board was different, right? Like you go back and you look at maybe the most famous UT editorial, or the two of the most famous ones, which is one about Barack Obama being the worst president of all time, which I've since apologized for because, you know, obviously there's one president who's more recent, a more recent president who's a little bit worse than Barack Obama was. But there are other presidents in our history who were worse than Barack Obama. So that is demonstrably false. So I've apologized for that. The other editorial was about his reelection when the editorial was in 2016. You know, we're going to have In God We Trust off our 2012, In God We Trust off of our dollar. You have to go to Mexico to get health coverage, healthcare, because there's going to be death penalty. Like all these like worst case scenarios, like everything that's wrong about a potential editorial was wrong about that one. You know, and that wasn't because Bill Osborne was like, I have a great idea, you guys. It was because the publishers like, no. We need to go full throttle to prevent the reelection of Barack Obama. I've been very fortunate to have a publisher who does not do that. Like I said, there was some minimal involvement this time around, and maybe that changes. And, you know, I think it's on me to explain, as I said, kind of with the toilet to tap example, if that changes, it'll be on me to explain that it has. You know, but I think San Diego readers are lucky because I used the example earlier of the Spokane example of the Spokane endorsement, where that publisher wrote an editorial calling themselves the board, and it was a shit show, pardon my French. So we've been very lucky in that regard. Thanks for that question, Dr. DiGiovanni.
Before we go, Matt, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Support local journalism. Full stop.
All right, well said. And support the San Diego Press Club. So if you are not a member, consider joining the San Diego Press Club at sdpressclub.org. Thank you, Matt Hall, editorial and opinion director at the San Diego Union-Tribune. And thank you to everyone who joined us this evening. It's great seeing everyone. I hope you all have a great night.
Thank you, guys. I enjoyed it. Thank you, Luis.
Thank you.
Take care. Stay safe, you guys.